Well, how about starting with it?
Okay, so with respect to the dependent nature, Khenpo Rinpoche says, quote, "The dependent nature is real existence, Denbar-drupa, truly existent." And so the one thing I wanted to bring up with respect to that is that Khenpo Tsultrim points out that it's important to note that the three natures as presented in the Cittamātra system are very different from the three natures presented in the empty of other Madhyamaka position or tenet system, because they're fundamentally different. And what's different is that with respect to the dependent nature, Cittamātras give it a real existence. They say it's Denbar-drupa. And empty of other Madhyamaka, with respect to those three same natures, uses Madhyamaka logic to say it's empty.
That's Khenpo Tsultrim's view of Cittamātra.
Yeah, but actually what I want to talk about is specifically the imaginary nature, and that alone with respect to in terms of Khenpo Tsultrim's presentation of the imaginary nature and progressive stages, and tying that into some of the terminology that Tsongkhapa uses.
In what system?
In the Cittamātra, mind-only system.
Okay.
So Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche, in his presentation of tenets, progressive stages of meditation and emptiness, begins the mind-only stage by stressing that as one moves from the Hinayana stage into the mind-only teachings of Mahayana, quote, "The motive for progressing further is compassion for other beings and the wish to remove their suffering. Compassion alone is not enough, however, it is also necessary to have the vision to see that the power to liberate others arises from seeing the true nature of reality more deeply. Thus, the Bodhisattva has two great aspirations. One is to liberate all sentient beings, and the other is to realize the profound emptiness of all phenomena, the realization of a fully awakened Buddha. End quote. In examining the imaginary nature, Parakalpada, or Gundak, the Khenpo states, quote, "The imaginary nature is without essence in the sense that it does not exist according to its own characteristic. For example, the imaginary fire does not have the characteristics of fire, which is hot and burning. In the same way, every phenomena that is a conceived object of a concept does not exist with its own characteristic." End quote. This is referred to by Tsongkhapa as the emptiness of being established by means of its own character as the referent of a conceptual consciousness.
So you think that presentation of Cittamātra and Tsongkhapa agree?
That aspect, yeah.
That aspect. Mm-hmm. I would say that the refutations of this presentation last week apply to this also, because he's talking about images, conceptual images of fire, and that not having qualities of fire, or as translator does.
Well, I'm getting to that.
Yep.
As for understanding what is meant by the emptiness of a difference in entity between subject and object, using the dream example, the Khenpo says, quote, "The person in the dream, imagined to be something separate from the things perceived in the dream, is completely imaginary, as are all the separate, independent entities that seem to appear in it. These are the imaginary nature." End quote. When one dreams, it appears as though there were a difference in entity between subject and object. It appears as though...
Now, does he say difference in entity? What does he say different?
Something separate from the things perceived in the dream.
No, you said difference in entity between subject and object.
Yeah.
Remember, a lot of Indians, or I think almost all of them, if not all, just said subject and object. That's the problem, rather than difference in entity. So that's a good thing to check.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, here we go. It says, "The person in the dream imagined to be something separate from the things perceived in the dream." This is the quote from Khenpo. is completely imaginary, as are all the separate independent entities.
Doesn't say. I don't think so. Independent entities says, you know, the wall and the table and this and that.
Yeah.
And you're not talking about difference of entity between subject and object necessarily.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at was that you're kind of using two tools. That two tools are being used to present one, the mind-only doctrine, and that when you start taking, you know, Tsongkhapa's tools to within Kempo's tools, then you there's sort of a lack of skillfulness, I think. It's almost like you have to take...
That's what I'm pointing out to you. That you've been so infected with Tsongkhapa's vocabulary that you're imposing it on Khenpo Tsujun Gyatso. And that you're not appreciating the different tools for what they are. It's not that I want to do this, it's that I'm pointing out that you most likely are doing this. Anyway.
Oh, okay.
Like, for instance, in the first part, equating Rangzhendope Shenshi Rangi Tendiki Truba with this false appearance, you can say, false appearance of the image of fire as if it's hot and burning. That those two aren't equivalent. And so to understand how there are two different tools here, you've got to separate them. But of course, did he say that? And we need his quotes and so forth.
What he's saying when he says that that imputational or imaginary nature does not have it. The imaginary nature is never anything but empty. The quote is, the imaginary nature is never anything but empty. The Klesha mind, seventh consciousness, produces the concept of a basic duality, and from that all their names and concepts follow. These are simply names and concepts, but none of the conceptualized entities they refer to exist. And it says, quote, this is the Kempo's quote, "We have no means of knowing whether any of us ever sees or experiences anything in exactly the same way as anybody else. At the same time, there is plenty of evidence that we do not see and experience the same thing in the same way. The difference is even more marked when one considers how differently different creatures experience the same thing. Take the example of someone like Chairman Mao. To some he appeared as a dangerous enemy, and to others a dear friend. Yet to a mosquito he appeared just as a source of nourishment, and to the parasites in his body a complete universe. Since for any object, its every aspect is established through the perception of the moments of consciousness perceiving it, how can its existence, independent of these consciousness, be established?"
And you have brought that over to generic images, Tunji. Okay, go ahead. I think it's evocative, standard presentation about mind only, but you have denuded it of its profundity. Please. You see, this is the basic reasoning showing that there's no external world. Since we all see things differently, that you don't have to get to Tunji to do that, generic images.
I guess I'm not sure how you're differentiating those. Tunji is a meaning generality.
Yeah, and it's a appearing object of a conceptual consciousness, and these things are appearing objects of non-conceptual consciousnesses. And he's saying we all see these things differently.
Yeah.
It's not that there's something out here that we superimpose a Tunji on. Do you follow? Not that we're superimposing a Tunji on it. There just is no external world.
I mean, if that was what he was saying, then he couldn't also say, quote, "the dependent nature is real existence."
No, it's right in the Sutra Unraveling the Thought.
Yeah.
It's the same thing Tsongkapa says. Real existence, a dependent nature means, oh, you're saying is an external world that really exists?
No, but he's not saying that there's nothing out, that there's no basis for the imaginary nature.
Yeah, but that, you want to say that that's out there.
Not externally. It's not an external object, but it's the other powered nature. It's the dependent nature. That's what that there is a basis.
And what produces it?
The alaya vijnana. It arises out of the alaya vijnana. Karma produces it.
That's the same entity as, or it's an appearance of the consciousness perceiving it. Anyway, you've got my comments. That's it. Good. So again, these are all introductions, and you know, why should I hold back? You know, you want to hear it now, don't you? You don't want to hear it later.
Absolutely. I'm not sure I want to hear it now. But I guess I'm gonna.
We'll give you. You can probably do yours in 8 minutes rather than 10.
Let's see. So what you have in front of you is excerpts from Sally King's book, Buddha Nature. And according to her, the Buddha nature theory is that all sentient beings possess the Buddha nature and thus are guaranteed the realization of Buddhahood. So she talks about the tathāgatagarbha, that this has two meanings, either as an embryonic Tathāgata or the womb of the Tathāgata. She gives a lot of background into the synthesis of Yogacara and Tathāgatagarbha thought, and is saying that there's a lot of similarities between the two.
So Tathāgatagarbha theory and Yogacara are different.
Right.
She doesn't identify Tathāgatagarbha as like Madhyamaka or whatever. No. She's saying it's what?
Well, she's saying that there were two
separate streams.
Yeah, two separate streams that came together.
Okay. It's interesting and very provocative.
Yeah, and the Buddha Nature Treatise, which is the actual text that she spends most of her time looking at, is one such syncretic text. It's Yogacara and Tathāgatagarbha coming together that way. But she's also saying that there's no reason that, there's not an antagonistic relationship between Madhyamaka and Yogacara, that Yogacara comes out of Shunya thought, so that essentially that Yogacara is the extension, it's the completion of Shunya thought.
So that type of idea of hers explains why Tsongkhapa in chapters 6 and 7, is it, goes to such lengths to show that the Yogacharans and Madhyamakas argued with each other. And because it's Tathāgatagarbha school or theory, it's wider than either Cittamātra or Madhyamaka, and you can't pin down what, you can't throw it into this school or that school, what he's talking about.
When he talks about, this author talks about the three natures and the two truths, there's a description about each of the natures.
Is this important non-existent imputational nature the act of imputing?
No, I wouldn't say it's the act of imputing.
Okay. What is it? It's a status that's falsely imputed, do you see?
Yeah.
And thus it can be non-existent. Whereas many, many people take it as meaning words or discrimination itself, and these should be, according to Tsongkhapa, should be other powered natures.
Right.
but there are statements that he had to clear up from a Sangha that refer to the imaginary nature as being words. He says words doesn't mean the imputing words, it means the status imputed by words. So, there are sources for what these people are thinking. And it's just, when probably almost all of you came to this class, you thought, right? There were some people at the beginning who were saying, well, it's words, and it's Turnji, and all that, you see? Which is fine for somebody else's system if they really did say it. So it's interesting. This is very common among European American, probably Japanese scholars too. And yes.
So then she goes on just in describing this, recognition of the discriminating nature implies an affirmation of non-being, since the discriminating nature is totally false. As for supreme truths, being cannot stand because persons and things are negated, that is, neither is said to be ultimately real.
How does that differ from Gelugpa runs on this?
That emptiness is a mere absence.
Yeah. It's one of their favorites. Except for Jungya, who, challenges this notion. There's evidence to the contrary. So my section on this is, do proponents of mind only meditate on mind only? Because the answer in the usual run of Gelug is no. But that they don't find a problem in that being excessively negative, because it doesn't cancel. It cancels the difference of entity between subject and object. It doesn't cancel subject and object. Good way to try to have your cake and eat it too, right? Okay, we move on. What do you think about the third volume? Does it drive you nuts? All this stuff on own character?
It does drive you nuts, but I don't know, somehow it seems to be like the language used is a little easier.
What I like about all three of them is that, you're always finding things that you've never even seen before.
Yes.
Little pockets of.
Me too. Did I write this? Yeah. Which means, did I write this down? Reading one of the texts. What other people say? Yes.
That was one thing that was really touching me. I was getting a real sense of, wow, I really get a sense of what's going on. These Gelugpa scholars, what they're actually doing, debating.
Yeah.
I thought, there's probably nowhere else where there's something like this. So I just had that moment of appreciation.
I had the sense of it getting, as you say, getting down to the ground. It's like the stuff that's really going on.
Yeah, I found some jewels in that are just in
Yes.
right in the middle of an argument. It's just like, yes, that's right.
Yes. Isn't it? It's just.
I think for me it's been nice to look in the table of contents and to choose things that I want to read about. Especially when I have questions in the other two books, it's nice to reference them.
Yeah. That's the intention. Another point that's interesting is the difficulty of maintaining in this variety of opinion a general explanation, or overall, that would be a good word, overall explanation that would be functional in meditation. That's what a lot of people lose. And so they switch to other types of meditations. Because, you don't know where to take a stance on this or that. And the arguments are so good on this side or that side. That's called the bamshe. It could be rough explanation. Among pledges, there are bambo. I believe it's spelled that way. Publ are sort of a coarser level, but it's not a coarser level that is like negated by the finer level. That's why overall explanation may be better. And it can be very rich and full and so forth, but you're just not tearing it apart. And, you know, somebody could say, oh, that's just the bombshell, you know. And that's, I think, misses the spiritual significance of the bombshell. And how a big point is how not to lose the bombshell.
Does Chang'e use this? He seems to be bent on that.
Yes, in his Trungta is for the most part, bombshell. So do we get your opinion?
I felt sorry for the people who didn't have the background in the basic language that we have, you know, in
Yes.
the terms.
Yes.
You know, what are they going to do?
I know. One of the readers, you know, said to wrote to Reed Malcolm, Mr. Malcolm, you know, their meaning was, don't worry about the fact that you don't understand what non-nature in terms of character means. Because I didn't either until I looked at the Tibetan. And so I put in a section on the difficult vocabulary, which I have to enlarge to the point where I make sure that, you know, all that I've got so far are three natures, three non-natures, and it's explicitly dealt with as being difficult, but part of the aesthetic delight that Indians take in using similar terminology with different meanings. Remember toward the beginning, people were saying here that, well, how could you have three natures that are three non-natures, you know? But that reference section, I think, maybe it even should be an appendix, a glossary, so that somebody would know where to turn to it.
That would be helpful
That's
because
a good idea.
things like, you know, existing from its own side all have a little bit, you know, they have some connotation like,
Yeah.
you know, it doesn't have to rely on another phenomenon, and to have lists of those kinds of things as how those are understood would be really helpful.
Definitely. At first, I found that the English, like you're saying, it kind of, you don't really understand what the English is talking about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me anyway, at first it was better to not even think about the English, but just, you know, the Tibetan, which I
Yes.
didn't get the finer nuances of either, but at least it was
Yes.
a label to put on
Yes.
it. So maybe that would be helpful to the Tibetan as well.
Maybe you should put a warning label on the jacket of these books. Don't open this unless you have access to an accomplished geshe.
I don't know though, it's like when you think about Zen and the faults that would come up for not having studied, say, could be addressed within the meditation practice. It seems like
Yes.
within philosophy.
You could start and then,
Yeah, it's like the obstacles you would come to because you hadn't studied the philosophy there would be other ways of getting through them.
yeah, or being taught since you'd have a sharper mind, you might be able to penetrate things more quickly. It's certainly how I started.
Yeah, because you would know what the
Meditations
words meant.
first.
But isn't it a stereotypical image of Zen that they don't study?
It's stereotypical and untrue.
Yeah.
Okay, now, it's 12:15 now. Okay, I said no. So let's do the reasonings for next time. And that is, you already began part of it, right? 401 to 427 in the Reflections on Reality. Okay.